Hi, I'm Mark Thorsby, and in this video we will be taking a look at diagramming arguments. And this is a supplement to the Introduction to Formal Logic video series on my YouTube channel. So, hope you're doing well. Hope this is going to be informative and helpful for you. So what I want to do in this video is sort of briefly talk about diagramming arguments and how we can begin to uncover and articulate the structure of the way in which our arguments are coupled together. You'll recall that an argument always has two fundamental two things: a conclusion as well as premises. Right. So all of these arguments, and we've looked at arguments and non-arguments, right, have both premises and a conclusion. The conclusion, of course, is the claim that someone's trying to prove, and the premises are the reasons why, right? Or the evidence that's given in terms of some conclusion or another. Let me hide this. So there's premises and conclusion, but one of the things you'll see is that when we actually use arguments, we see that there's a whole bunch of different premises that are all related to the conclusion, but in slightly different ways. And so what we want to do when we diagram arguments is we want to be able to uncover the structure of an argument and its relationship and the way in which the premises relate to the conclusion. And by the end of this video, you'll see why, right? So think of it like this. Think of the premises as like the stuff, and the conclusion is the product that gets created out of that stuff. And we're going to be using, to diagram them, we're essentially going to be using a couple of sort of symbols. We're going to use a downward arrow symbol, and this will represent one step of inference, right? So for instance, if I say, for instance, it's cold outside. Here, I'll go down here. I think I've written it out. Let's see, where is it over here? If I say, for instance, it's cold outside, so you should wear a jacket, right? It's cold outside, so you should wear a jacket. So imagine someone says this. Now, this isn't a formal argument. This is not even the best type of argument. I wouldn't really recommend it, right? But this is the kind of arguments you actually are going to hear and encounter in your life, right? So the first sort of thing to do is to figure out what the conclusion is. The conclusion is going to be what we see a conclusion indicator term here, so, which tells us that that what follows here is going to be the conclusion. So what we're going to do is, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to number, here I'll write down the steps here. One is we're going to number the propositions. Sorry, it's making very odd looking handwriting. Right, so first we're going to number the propositions, and we have to differentiate which one's the conclusion. So this first one here, we'll do a 1. I think I'm going to have to do it bigger. And the second one here is going to be a 2. And we can represent it using our arrow that I showed you earlier. And what we do is here is that 1, right, is the inference that's being supported here is 2, where what follows down here is the conclusion. And what follows up here is the premise. Okay, so 1 follows 2. So that's the first sort of thing. So this arrow always represents one step in the inferential link, one step of inference, right? Now, what we're going to see is there's multiple ways in which they can connect. So we're going to add another symbol. And this here is just what looks like a normal plus sign or an addition sign. And what we're going to mean is here is, so for instance, if you want to combine two premises together, those two premises combined can support a third conclusion, for instance. So let's scroll over here and let's take a look at what the example is. I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger. I think that's the problem I'm having in terms of my text. It's kind of small. So let's just make this one nice and big for us. Okay, so now someone says this. It's cold outside and jackets keep people warm, so you should wear a jacket. So imagine if we were going to diagram this argument here. We're slowly building in complexity. First is just to number the propositions. So, and keep in mind the difference between a proposition and a statement. So we're numbering the meaning, the claims that are being made. We're not worried about where the ands and all this stuff are located. So first off, you notice there is a conclusion indicator term here. So this is going to be your conclusion, right? But it is cold outside. This is our first proposition. And we're not going to symbolize that. Jackets keep people warm is our second proposition. And then the third proposition here is, and so you should wear a jacket outside. So the way we would diagram this is say that, well, 1 and 2 combined is what supports 3, right? And what we can say here is that 1 and 2 are dependent upon each other, right? Or we should say when they're combined together, they really give you the argument here of why one should wear the jacket, as it were, right? So this is another example. I'm just going to give you ever more increasing examples here with this example. So let's take a look here and see how another example might look. And make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so let's imagine someone tells you this. It's cold outside, and the coach wants you to be visible, so you should wear a jacket outside. Now, I'm imagining maybe there's someone, they're going outside to play a game or to represent their team or something like this. Well, how would we diagram this one? Well, again, same conclusion, right? And that's going to be number 3. And then we have, it is cold outside. We have that original premise, so that's 1. And the coach wants you to be visible, 2. Now, unlike our previous example, where the first 2 premises were connected in terms of some sort of dependency on each other, that is, they made sense together. Here, we see that these are independent premises, right? It's cold outside and the coach wants you to be visible are not necessarily dependent types of things, right? The coach could want you to be visible for a lot of different reasons and doesn't really seem to have to do with temperature. So what we would say here is that we have a 1, we have a 2, but that both the 1 supports the conclusion and the 2 both supports the conclusion, but they support them separately. So we don't use the addition sign in this example. So you can say in this case, there's 2 different reasons that are being given for the conclusion. And here we would say is that there's 2 dependent reasons given for this conclusion. Okay, let's see here. Is that the example? Those are the main examples. One of the things is you'll see is there's multiple structures possible, right? So you can imagine a whole bunch of different structures. For instance, you can have a premise that supports maybe 2 or 3 other premises, right? So you could have something that looks lopsided, like 2, 3, and 4, right? And then, for instance, you could have an argument that goes on to then support number 5, right? You can imagine a whole bunch of different ranges. You could have 1 and 2, and then let's make this a 7 or something. It really doesn't matter what you number them, but you can see here is that what we're basically saying is you can just begin to diagram these relationships and patterns. I think a really key thing to recognize here, let me scroll down here, is a couple different things that are worth remembering. The first is just to ask yourself whether or not the premises are dependent or not. And so how are you going to know that? Well, what you have to ask yourself, if you're not sure if something is a dependent premise, you're not sure what that is, whether or not to use the plus, right? The plus in between 2 different propositions, then what you can just ask yourself is, well, does the premise make sense by itself to prove the conclusion? If the answer is no, then that's not good. Then it needs a dependent premise. It needs something else with it. But if you could, so another way of doing it is imagine that all the other premises in your argument are false, and we just ignore them completely. If that was the case, would the premise you're evaluating be enough to support the conclusion? If it would be, then it's an independent premise, not a dependent premise. It takes some time. In general, if you're in doubt, if you're really unclear about whether or not something's dependent or independent, it's best to assume that it's dependent. it's best to assume that it's dependent. So there may be some variation here. So let me give you an example of what some, let me do 2 more examples here, just to give you some examples here. A little bit more complicated. I'll start with. Make these bigger. Let's see if we can do an example here. Oops. Okay. So let's imagine someone makes this argument. Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. If we take eternity, that should be eternity. Oops. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. Our life has no end in just the way in which our visual field has no limits. So the first thing we have to do here is first, let's just figure out what are the premises and what's the conclusion. And let's just underline them. And I'm going to try to, let's just go through it. So death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. I actually think that entire thing is its own proposition. It's its own statement. Some people might be confused by what this colon means here. I think really what it's saying here is death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. Is this colon is telling you it is using this subclause to explain itself. So I think this is one proposition. The next one here is, if we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. Now, one of the things we've covered in the course is the idea of a conditional statement. Okay? A conditional statement, just to recall, this is sort of review. A conditional statement is any statement that has an if blank, then blank, right? Notice that a conditional statement is one proposition. It's just one proposition. So what we'd have to say here, so when you look at this, you'll notice we have an if, and we have a then, right? But this entire thing is actually number 2. We have 1, we have 2. And then the last one here is, our life has no end, in just the way our visual field has no limits. Okay? This would be number 3. Okay? So we have 1, 2, and 3. So the question here is, what is the conclusion? And here's where it's difficult, because we're lacking one of these conclusion indicator terms like so, therefore, or thus. So what are we supposed to do? Well, stop and ask yourself, what is the basic takeaway of this passage? What does this person want me to walk away thinking? I think they want you to think is that death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. Our life has no end in just the way in which our visual field has no limits, right? So this one's talking about, number 3 is talking about death. Number 2 is qualifying what we mean by eternity. And the first one here, death is not an event in life, I think this actually is, I don't know if I would say it's the conclusion, but it's what's being inferentially supported. And I think it's something like this. We have 2 and 3 actually are actually supporting number 1. So this is one that's a little bit different. And the difficulty here is because it's lacking a one of these nice premise indicator terms. But you can see that with, just by taking a look at it slowly, they become apparent. So let's take one more argument, and I'll tell you this one is much more complicated. But I wanted to give you a nice one. Give you a nice argument to think about as we keep going here. So let's move this up here. Because there is a law such as gravity. Sorry, someone's calling me. Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. It's not necessary to invoke God to set the universe going. So you can see here, This is the opposite sort of view, or different but slightly related. But what we got to do here is first, let's just begin by labeling the premises. Now notice we have a because there is a law of gravity. This is a premise indicator term, which tells us that what this is here, there is a law of gravity. There's such a law of gravity. Because there is such a law of gravity, the universe can and will create. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. So this is number one. The universe can and will create itself from nothing, we'll say as number two. And then we've got, what is it? Spontaneous creation is the reason. Now, is the reason, that tells us right now that this is a premise too. So let's put 3. There is something rather than nothing. I'm just going to put it like this. We got 4. Why the universe exists, 5. Why we exist, 6. And then another one here, it is not necessary to invoke God to set the universe going. So let's say that's number 7. I apologize, my numbering doesn't look that clear. Right? So how are we supposed to do this, right? So first off, we have, because there is such a law of gravity, so let's start with this, then the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That seems to be the argument, is if you have 1, that from 1 we go to 2. Now, keep in mind here, we're not determining whether or not this is true. Right? Whether or not this person is right, we have to make a distinction actually between analysis and evaluation. First, we analyze the argument, and by analyzing, we look to see if we can understand what the structure of the argument is. Right? Evaluation is when we assess the argument, when we determine if the argument is a good or bad argument. So right now, we're not evaluating it, so we're not looking to see if these are true. We just want to say, this argument seems to be that this is the premise for this claim, right? Now, the next one here, spontaneous creation is the reason that there's something rather than nothing. And we get a whole slew of things. In fact, we get a list of 3, and they all seem to be following out of this. So I think we do something like this. Since we have 3, we can get 4. If we have 3, we can get 5. If we have 3, we can get 6, right? That is the reason there's something rather than nothing, why we exist, or why the universe exists, right? And then it says, it is not necessary to invoke God. So 7. So I think what's happening here is that these, we put like this. Here's number 7. So we have an argument structure in which really there's 2 sides of the argument that are being supported. The conclusion is being supported on the one hand by all of this business about the law of gravity and the universe creating itself from nothing. And then on the other hand, we have this argument about spontaneous creation, which these are not really the same thing, though there is a sort of relationship to them. Okay, so that's the sort of last example of giving the argument. What you're going to find is that there's lots of different patterns that are possible, and it gets actually kind of fun. And one of the things that's quite helpful is, even though most of the course we're not going to be really doing any argument diagrams, this may actually be very helpful for you in your life, or in your other classes, or when you're reading a book and you want to analyze someone's argument. Right? Someone might give you an argument that looks like this. Right. So there's different ways the arguments can go, where you can have one premise that supports 3 more, and then this premise supports an intermediary premise which gets you to some sort of conclusion before it takes you directly to the conclusion. You can imagine this seems like a pretty strong argument. It would seem certainly stronger than something like this. Like imagine you had another argument that had a structure that looked like this. You could ask yourself, which argument is stronger, right? Well, naturally you'd say this argument, because this 4th premise actually supports it. In this case, these 2 premises seem to be somewhat irrelevant to the conclusion. They're just perhaps stated, and that's sometimes that's what people do in their arguments, is they begin arguments, they don't finish them. And so when you're diagramming these arguments, your goal is to try to describe and evaluate the argument that's actually given, not to evaluate it or assess it, whether or not it's a good or a bad argument, but just to understand what the reasoning process is that's being presented. You may sometimes disagree with the reasoning process, but that'll be important. So in some of the exercises we're seeing, there a lot of times they will even give you the structure, and you're going to fill in the structure with with different varying premises. In other practice exercises, what you'll do is they'll number the premises for you, or they'll just give you an argument and just have you diagram it. Do your best, and remember, just try to think. Always try to identify first what the premises are, or to identify what all the propositions are. Then identify what the conclusion is, and then from there you can usually work your way fairly well through it. So thank you very much for watching this. This is my first video in the logic series in a while, and I should say I apologize. My equipment seemed to be a little bit clunky this morning. So thank you very much, and I'll see you guys online.